Okay, we're back. We've talked about Skrefsrud and a root in Scandinavian pietism, our way back into the middle of the 19th century. We've talked about Ernest and Hildegard Weinhardt and John Carlson, a kind of movement of God's Spirit on the campus of the Lutheran Bible Institute in the 1920s and the 1930s. Today we come back to a third root, and this is really the root that brings us kind of right up to date in a way. And the people we'll be talking about today are folk that you might actually have heard of. People like Paul and Margaret Lindell. People like Jonathan Lindell, Paul's brother, and Evie, his wife. These are folks who really gave, more than anyone else, shape to the World Mission Prayer League. I mean, like structure and policy to the World Mission Prayer League. These are the people that codified the World Mission Prayer League back in the 1940s. Paul wrote our first version of the handbook that you've been studying now, I think, these days. He wrote it in 1945. Jonathan wrote The Heart of the Mission, a final chapter to the handbook, and to kind of codify and to describe the basic policies of the World Mission Prayer League. So, I mean, we're in an ongoing process. We're always redoing our policy, it seems like. We're always wanting to make our policy relevant for a new day. But these are the people from whom it came originally. This is root 3, and it's kind of the basic and foundational policy layer, you might say, to the World Mission Prayer League. Okay, so here we go. Let me introduce you to these guys, Jonathan and Paul Lindell. These guys stand right at the heart of the World Mission Prayer League. I don't think there's anyone that has contributed more to the heart and soul of who we are as an organization than this pair of missionary kids from China. Paul was born in 1915 and died in 1974. Jonathan, a couple of years younger, born in 1917 and died in 1985. Both served as directors of the World Mission Prayer League. They were missionary kids from China, and so was Margaret Sovic, Margaret Lindell, who became Paul's wife. And this figured hugely in their own kind of spirituality and what they brought to the World Mission Prayer League later in life as they returned to the United States as college students. Paul and Margaret Lindell, well, they were impressed with people like this. Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor was a hero of these young men who became the founder of the China Inland Mission in 1865, who left his spiritual mark not only on Paul and Jonathan Lindell, but on an entire generation of missionary enthusiasts, missionary disciples. They took a tremendous amount of inspiration from Hudson Taylor. And I have too. Let me share with you a couple of quotes from Hudson Taylor, and this will give you an idea about the kind of stuff that Paul and Margaret and Jonathan and Evie brought into the World Mission Prayer League. Hudson Taylor said stuff like this. Taylor said, "All God's giants have been weak men and women who did great things for God because they reckoned on God being with them." This was the edginess to Hudson Taylor. He believed that you didn't have to be anybody special to become a missionary or to accomplish huge things for God if you only counted on God being with you. Here's another one. God's work done in God's way will never lack for God's supply. Hudson Taylor was famous for wanting to depend upon God for the supply of all of his needs. And this is something that Paul and Margaret Lindell and Jonathan and Evie brought into the World Mission Prayer League too. A sense of kind of radical and experimental dependence upon God in prayer. So Hudson Taylor was a part of their background. This woman was a part of their background too. If you were to study the history of the house church in China, you might have heard of her. She was very significant in the early years of the emergence of the house church, and was especially famous for being right at the center of a revival movement that flowered in the 1930s, between 1930 and 1933. It was called the Shantung Revival. She was a Norwegian Lutheran missionary. Her name was Marie Munson. And this woman preached all around the place. She talked with people about their faith. She prayed for healing and people got healed. She talked with people about assurance of salvation. And folk got revived like crazy all across the country. And not only in the house church, but also in the missionary community. And also on the campuses of those missionary kid schools where, like, Paul and Margaret Lindell were students. They got wind of this thing, and they themselves got revived as young people under the influence of none other than Marie Munson. Well, Marie was really famous for, again, the spirit of prayer. Here's something she said. The Spirit of God was at work among us at this time of refreshing. It was said that every cupboard and corner of the little houses, she was talking about the house churches, was used continually for prayer. Well, that's what she preached, and that's what happened. And that, too, is part of what the Lindells brought with them back again to America when they returned to go to college here as young people. They were filled with the example of people like this. C.T. Studd, the famous London cricketer who became the founder of the Heart of Africa mission. C.T. Studd, who said stuff like this. He said, "If Jesus Christ be God and died for me, then no sacrifice can be too great for me to make for him." Wow, I mean, this kind of stuff just reverberated in young Paul and Jonathan and Margaret and Evie's hearts. He said stuff like this: Christ wants not nibblers of the possible, but grabbers of the impossible. I hope that you get a feel for the kind of thing that these young people brought with them into our fellowship back in the 1930s. They were filled with the example of people like this. Here's Norman Grubb, who lived from 1895 to 1993. Norman Grubb married the daughter of C.T. Studd. Her name was Pauline. Paul and Jonathan were just taken with the story of the cricketer and then the Heart of Africa mission, and then something that C.T. Studd founded called the World Evangelization Crusade. Later, Norman Grubb became the director of that same organization. Paul and company modeled the World Mission Prayer League really after that thing, and they wanted to build our policies based on those policies. So here's a couple of quotes from Norman Grubb. "Somehow you've come past the realm of just knowing about this person called Jesus Christ, and he is real to you." In other words, he's not like just some kind of a theoretical reality. He gets into your heart and into your life and into your daily routine, into your thinking and your speech and your behavior. He becomes real to you. Norman Grubb also said this: "Prayer meetings are dead affairs when they are merely asking sessions. There is adventure, hope, and life when they are believing sessions, and the faith is corporately, practically, and deliberately affirmed." So that kind of stuff was the soup in which Paul and Jonathan were raised. And that kind of stuff they brought back with them to the United States when they came here as college students. Paul went to Gustavus Adolphus down in St. Peter. And eventually he got connected then with those revived and reviving students up at LBI, with the South American Mission Prayer League that was underway there, with the residue of old Skrefsrud himself and that Norwegian missionary experiment, and he brought all of that kind of stuff there to the campus of the Lutheran Bible Institute, and it was dynamite. It was just dynamite. It was dynamite. There were so many revived Lutheran students at the Bible school, and Paul's emphasis on Grubb and C.T. Studd and Hudson Taylor and Marie Munson, revival and radical faith and community, it just had fertile ground there. They created something that they called the Lutheran World Crusade. The Lutheran World Crusade. And they began to publish a magazine that they called the Lutheran World Vision. You probably didn't know that World Vision was our magazine before it became the magazine of a more famous agency today. And these folk were interested in kind of building a world evangelization crusade within the Lutheran family of churches. Legend has it that Paul and Lindell volunteered for service with Norman Grubb himself. And when Norman Grubb discovered that Paul and Lindell was a Lutheran, he said, "Man, you should go back to the Lutheran Church. And you should create something like this in the family of the Lutheran Church. The Lutheran Church needs this kind of thing. You go and you do it, Paul." And Paul, legend has it, Paul took that as the calling of God to build the Lutheran World Crusade within the Lutheran family of churches. I tell you, it was dynamite. The students began calling themselves crusaders, and they began to look for their particular and personal participation in the world program of God. So here's how they described it. They said, "Our program is serving the broad vision in the local commission, and in turn then drawing from the local situation that which would serve the broad vision." That's the way they described it in 1943 in the KCNL, the King's Crusaders newsletter. So in other words, they wanted to be a part of the worldwide program of Christ, and they wanted to find their own particular niche in it, even if it meant something kind of just mundane and ordinary, working at home or in the factory or at school or off back at the farm or things like that. Whatever it was, they found their calling in it. It was their commission. They called it discovering their commissioned living. And they told about it as they wrote back to the King's Crusader newsletter. They gave their testimonies. Here's a testimony from a woman named Edel Ruth Monrad. Edel Ruth Monrad, King's Crusader who was attending LBI, is now stationed in South Dakota, tending chickens and cooking for her dad and brother. You see, her dad and brother thought that she had just come home to tend chickens, that she came home as like an agent of the kingdom of God. We heard a testimony from Lorraine Hegland, who was learning patience at her monotonous defense job. Well, she was working for the Army, I guess. And they just thought that they had this young woman from Minnesota to help them peel potatoes and such. But Lorraine knew that she was there because of God's appointment. "I'm enjoying the farm every day. We're tremendously busy, but it's satisfying work, especially since I know I am here because God has put me here. I'm perfectly happy to be here now, yet all eager to be off to San Francisco when the time comes." Well, just a footnote, that's where John Carlson and Ernest Weinhardt took off to. They went to San Francisco en route to South America. And in fact, they only discovered that they were going to go to Bolivia once they got to San Francisco, and went down to the docks and met somebody from Bolivia and took it as the voice of God and went off to Bolivia as missionaries. So that was kind of the model they had in mind. Man, we're going to go to San Francisco, and from there we're going to find our place in the world program. So she says, "I can't wait. but I just can't step back from the vision that God has given me. I'm increasingly thankful that I didn't choose to go out there, but that God has called me to it, and I can't do anything else but. So she's there on the farm and she's working hard, and she's waiting for the moment when she's released to go off to San Francisco. Here, Laverne McCullough writes, I had a tendency to get discouraged here, thinking that all that I was doing was learning how to cook. But the Lord faced me up and brought me clear through to victory on that matter. I don't know how cooking fits into the crusade, but thank the Lord, He knows. And that's what counts. And finally, from Betty Broody. Betty was one of our early leaders, and she went about preaching to student groups all across the Midwest. And this is a little report from one of her preaching and teaching junkets. Betty Broody told of living on the word sent at the evangelistic conference last week in Illinois. It is wonderful to know the reality of being sent by God into the various circumstances that come up. One who is sent is completely backed up by the sender and can count on his provision. One who is sent has a definite purpose to fulfill. His life is not haphazard. It is a very enjoyable joke, too, to know the reality of being sent when feelings and results testify to the contrary. This is what our early mothers and fathers meant when they talked about commissioned living. They meant discovering our personal role, our personal place, our personal participation in the world kingdom of Christ. It might mean that we're peeling potatoes, or tending chickens, or maybe going to school, or maybe working in a factory, or maybe teaching in a classroom. It might mean that we're preaching the gospel, or doing the work of an evangelist. It might mean almost anything. It might mean that we're nurses or doctors or teachers or farmers or engineers or secretaries or whatever it might be. In any and every case, if we give these things to God as participants and as members of his mission in the world, then they become our commission for his sake and for the sake of the gospel. That's discovering our commission. And living like that is commissioned living.